everyone. Monica Kim. My own work is on U.S. and the world history, work I'm doing right now, finishing up a book on a history of military interrogation rooms during the Korean War. So because Molly has already talked about the post-war refugee regime, and I think we can all certainly agree about the Eurocentric origins of this regime, I'm going to tighten our focus on a particular economy between militarism and the refugee regime, specifically U.S. imperial liberal warfare in the post-1945 era, and how the U.S. military, both in terms of violence and bureaucracy, produces stateless peoples and an entire variety of conditions of statelessness. Tracking how the United States has made statelessness a key mechanism of liberal war-making is critical to understanding the particular hegemonic paradigm of interventionism the United States heralded, fashioned, and implemented in every hot war the United States fomented during the Cold War. Militarism and statelessness have been hallmarks of U.S. intervention in both overt and covert warfare in the Middle East, in East and Southeast Asia, in Latin America, and sites all over the African continent. Stateless peoples produced by U.S. military mass violence or anti-communist authoritarian regimes supported by U.S. military and covert operations appear in many guises. They can be refugees, they can be called a variety of different kinds of immigrants. I think Sarah may be talking more about this, but Andrew, I think, had also mentioned this last week when we think about the 1980s with the sanctuary movement. That was all around people from El Salvador whom the U.S. was branding as, economic migrants, not political asylum seekers, because the U.S. wanted to withhold recognition that, because if they recognized that they were actually seeking political asylum, the U.S. would then have to also recognize that they were the ones who were supporting the repressive state in El Salvador, and therefore actually creating, right, this kind of push. So the proliferation and strategic use of language around statelessness, we actually see that also in the language around warfare in this post-1945 moment. So post-1945, we have on one hand, we've got mass escalation of state-sponsored violence across the globe. We also have the proliferation of laws of war, right? On the other hand, suddenly, states are no longer declaring war officially. So, and in that space, we have states now using monikers like police action, military occupation, or wars of intervention. So the seemingly dizzying array of monikers for both subjects and warfare is, again, not by accident. And what I want to say is that the ambiguity is actually entirely the point. So I'd like to tell a history about statelessness that shows two key things. First, that statelessness is not the accidental collateral effect of the nation-state system. It is, in fact, a deep mechanism operative to the nation-state system. Two, that stateless people do not come from what mainstream politics called failed states. Stateless people come out of the post-war nation-state system as forged in a particular crucible of demands and struggles over decolonization, or we can say really incomplete or perhaps deferred decolonization. So I'm going to focus on the United States and Asia during the Korean War. And besides the fact that this is actually what this is the area that I do a lot of research in, but with what is happening in the news, right, I thought this was going to be very important because there is a lot of conversation about refugees, possible refugees from North Korea, and that's happening alongside this kind of rhetoric of fire and brimstone and who has a bigger nuclear button. So Trump's rhetoric is utterly inflammatory, but what has been concerning actually for people on the Korean Peninsula are the annual war games that have been going on ever since the signing of the ceasefire in 1953 of the Korean War. And these are annual war games that are practiced by both the US and South Korean militaries, where they actually enact invading North Korea. So this happens every year. So there is a lot of tension and concern about what might happen if there is a particular kind of flashpoint, right? The tinderbox of a certain kind of rhetoric and a certain kind of consensus about North Korean refugees, et cetera, what is going to happen on the Korean Peninsula. Okay, so I'm going to focus on kind of 3 points for us today, 3 points in time. First one, I'm going to be looking at a population called Zainichi Koreans in Japan right after 1945. I'm then going to look and really draw upon Mimi Nguyen's book, The Gift of Freedom, to kind of talk about Vietnamese war refugees. And then I'm going to end with discussing 2 particular bills that were introduced in the early 2000s concerning both North Korean regime change as desired by Congress and also how the US Congress was defining the refugee problem. And what I'm hoping to kind of show you guys is that when we finally arrive at these 2 bills in Congress, that we can see how this is in a longer history of how the US is actually trying to strategically create statelessness. And in this case, it's a strategic sort of statelessness that is going to then justify a kind of intervention, which is with an endgame of regime change. Zainichi Koreans in 1945, they are like the community that is reminding everybody in metropole Japan about Japanese colonial rule. So Japanese colonial rule claims it to be a protectorate over Korea in 1907 and then creates a colony in 1910. So in 1945, with the unconditional surrender of the Japanese, what you have is the liberation of Korea from Japanese colonial rule. So Zainichi, that term actually means foreigner or foreign. It has a derogatory connotation, but Zainichi Korean community has taken that on as a kind of political, a way to politically make sure that Japanese society cannot forget, right? So who are they? Why are they there? They are there because of a labor shortage in the Japanese metropole in the 1920s. And this actually results in a population of 2 million Koreans in Japan by 1945. And basically, Japan's expansionist project under World War II obviously required a lot of resources and a lot of labor. And between 1939 and 1945, the colonial government in Korea actually would recruit, often by force, a total of over 700,000 Koreans and sent them over to industrial sites in mainland Japan, usually to work in factories and also in mines. So, why am I bringing in Zainichi Koreans into the story about US militarism and statelessness? As I tell you the story about US military occupation and Japanese post-war society, we see how the different conditions and the different choices made by both Japanese society and the US military occupation actually turned Zainichi Koreans into stateless people inside Japan, within the very borders that they were already contained within. And it's to the extent that even today, especially for Zainichi Korean activists, it's actually very difficult to leave Japan because they would have to apply for visas from both Japan and wherever the other country would be. And so that really complicates their ability to move. Okay, so August 15th, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito's speech announcing Japan's surrender is broadcasted over the radio, the US military makes a note about basically throughout factories, through different mining sites, there is basically a demand from the Korean workers for either back wages, right? They're demanding better conditions, but they're going further than that too. And there is one instance about 10 Korean miners who were basically a little intoxicated in celebratory drinks because Korean liberation had come. And they went into their Japanese supervisor's office. They smashed some office equipment, cursed the supervisors, and said, "Japan was defeated. This time we will exploit you." So there's going to be some changes happening. So what did change and what did not change? So among this population, 2 million Koreans in Japan in 1945, those who could afford to, they did go back to the Korean peninsula, whether north or south. And so what I want to remind us here is that 1945, it's a moment of Korean liberation from Japanese colonial rule, but it is also the moment of the 38th parallel. 38th parallel, how does this come about? This is another story about borders and US militarism. Basically, I believe maybe it was the night before, kind of anticipating the Japanese unconditional surrender, 2 US colonels were given the task to figure out where should the Korean peninsula be divided in order to propose that to the Soviets. And so there was this idea that the North would be under foreign military occupation by the Soviets, and the South would be militarily occupied by the US. And so these 2 colonels, they had no previous knowledge about Korea. I guess we are used to hearing that. They had no previous knowledge about Korea, and all they had was a really not good National Geographic map. So they have a National Geographic map, and they're looking at it and they're saying, okay, we have also been told that Seoul, okay, the city of Seoul needs to be under US military occupation. Oh, look at the 38th parallel. So the 30th parallel actually had no correspondence to any kind of cultural or even geographic kind of boundary or division on the ground. So 38th parallel is now a border. And what's happening in the South under US military occupation is that they are propping up Syngman Rhee. And Syngman Rhee is an anti-communist, we can call it a fascist regime that's basically being supported by the US military, but fervently anti-communist, and this is where US and South Korea's military work very well together under the name of national security. Zainichi Koreans, even if they were from the South, didn't necessarily want to go to the South. So if we've got Zainichi Koreans, right, of whom the vast majority were brought in as forced laborers to work in mines and factories, they maybe, perhaps, have a more open ear to thinking about redistribution, right? To thinking about communism, right? And Syngman Rhee knew this, and he also did not necessarily want the Zainichi Korean population, although he did want the leaders. And the US military sometimes did deliver the leaders, and Syngman Rhee would then imprison them, and they were usually even though it's hard to find exactly the archival trace, which I think is for a reason, but that they were usually executed. So, Zainichi Koreans, they're puzzling over how to negotiate all of this, and also because we're talking about maybe about 2 generations, possibly more at that time, of Zainichi Koreans in Japan, they also have a community in Japan. All right. So, the U.S. military occupation of Japan. For the U.S. military, this occupation is really, how to say, World War II and the forcing the hand of Japanese unconditional surrender is done by extraordinary mass violence, right? 2 atomic bombs, kind of unprecedented firebombing. So you have that. And the US military really wants to turn around and really viewed its project of occupying Japan as rehabilitating Japan into kind of a recognizable US branded democracy, which meant that that Japan would then become within the orbit of US Cold War national security. Before this US project in Japan, the colonial subjects who were still in Japan kind of poses a bit of a problem. For example, in Nagasaki, as you know, so that's one of the sites that were targeted by the atomic bombs, was a huge industrial center. Zainichi, so there's a very large Zainichi Korean community. So it meant that there were Korean laborers who were living in Nagasaki who were also victims of the atomic bomb, and I'll kind of return to that. So in 1945, there are still 600,000 Zainichi Koreans remaining in Japan. So what is going to happen to them in this US project of nation building and national security state democracy? What happens is that the Zainichi Korean population essentially becomes stateless. Now, why? Well, why is as I had mentioned, that there is a need on the US part and also on the Japanese part to quickly erase colonial reminders in order for the US to say that they were actually successful in both de-imperializing this former enemy and had rehabilitated Japan successfully into a Cold War ally. So in 1945, what happens is that all Zainichi Koreans, they had been Japanese nationals under colonialism, but in 1945 they are then stripped of suffrage. So they no longer have voting rights. With the 1952 San Francisco Peace Treaty, which is the brokered deal by the United States between Japan and the areas that were under occupation or colonial rule. It's a little more complicated than that when we kind of get to the ground, but just remember 1952 San Francisco Peace Treaty. What happens with this peace treaty is that Zainichi Koreans are all deprived of Japanese nationality, and then they are placed under what is called the Alien Registration Law, which meant that Zainichi Koreans were now considered foreigners or sojourners. Fingerprinting was now required, and that was very humiliating for Zainichi Koreans because at that time, only criminals were required to be fingerprinted. And as a result, Zainichi Koreans also could not, and still to this day, for example, if they do not nationalize, they cannot get work in public sector jobs. Now, they could naturalize, but they were required to take on either a Japanese name or a Japanese sounding name. And perhaps not so surprisingly, the numbers of Zainichi Koreans who actually naturalized remained low. And this remained in place until 1985. And to this day, Zainichi Koreans are not born with citizenship unless their parents had citizenship already. Also, to this day, the US and Japan both do not recognize the Korean victims of the atomic bombings. So again, statelessness, memory, right, justice, and militarism. Okay, so I'm going to now move, and a lot of that, what I had just relayed to all of you, much of that also comes out of the work of a historian named Dokyo Choi. And if any of you are interested in doing a little bit more research into this, please come talk with me. I can tell you more about some of the really exciting history writing that is being done on this. Okay, so let's now move to Vietnam. So in the United States, the figure of the refugee is most often associated, at least at this point, right, with the Vietnam War in terms of thinking about past wars. And indeed, American involvement and bombing in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia essentially displaced millions. By 1971, war in Vietnam, the economic and cultural destruction, Nixon's secret war of bombing Cambodia, all of this had created over 6 million refugees in South Vietnam ever since 1965. President Ford and President Kennedy, President Ford really saw Southeast Asian refugees at this point as kind of victims of communism. Kennedy was the one who then talked about these refugees as being as being victims of human rights abuses, and I'm going to come back to how the figure of the Vietnam War refugee and humanitarianism, what that actually does in terms of thinking about the history of U.S. militarism. So with President Ford and Kennedy, the language that they use in terms of persuading Congress to offer admission to these refugees to the United States would be in the position of granting freedom to these refugees. So very much within the Cold War, right, story. And in 1975, we have the Indochina Migration and Refugee Assistance Act, which allowed for 200,000 Vietnamese to come to the United States as refugees. 50,000 of those 200,000 were slotted, those positions were slotted for high-risk refugees, and these were people who were current or former employees of the U.S. government. How do we think about what changes, again, from the Zainichi Korean case to then thinking about Vietnam War refugees? So in Gift of Freedom, Mimi Nguyen talks about this offering of refuge to Vietnamese refugees as an extension of war making. And this is very important to understand about liberal warfare as practiced by the United States. And kind of a very key term that Nguyen uses, Nguyen talks about indebtedness, that the Vietnamese refugee must be doubly grateful and indebted to the United States for rescue from war and for military intervention or rescue from communism. The figure of the refugee and the conditions of liberal warfare, this is the ecosystem of violence where the enactment of violence and precarity is done over and over the same population. In a sense, it's a kind of policing of the refugee. As a Vietnamese refugee, you must be grateful. And it is, in fact, this kind of gratitude that prevents a discussion of the actual violence experienced or preventing a discussion about the possible politics the refugee person could hold regarding both the war and the refugee experience. As we know, the refugee status in the United States is precarious and contingent, and to be ungrateful opens one up to being possibly criminalized. By being ungrateful, you are then a national security threat. You are an already always foreigner. Now, the institutionalization of the refugee category goes hand in hand with the rise of Western humanitarian organizations and discourse. But just as quickly, there is again the very rapid fragmentation of who can claim refuge. So again, the difference between being, for example, an economic migrant versus a seeker of political asylum. And one thing I just want to kind of note as one thing to kind of hold in mind, and again, Andrew had mentioned this last week. So being a refugee not only does not guarantee that you are actually going to be given a space of refuge, right? But it's also important to pay attention to how refugees can also politically, right, strategically refuse to take kind of permanent refuge in order to expose how their condition of statelessness is not one that was inevitable, but is actually a current ongoing political problem. So in terms of thinking about, again, Palestinian refugees. So in this logic where being a refugee does not guarantee refuge, something quite fundamental is exposed about the refugee regime, especially from the standpoint of the United States. And that is, the whole point of the refugee system is about those who give refuge, not about those who have been made refugees. So this kind of continuing Mimi Nguyen's argument. So it's the act of granting refuge, the act of rescue. This is the act that confirms the humanity, the moral liberalism, the full personhood of those who enact refuge. Thus, when a state refuses to grant refuge or mobilizes a system of deportation or disappearance, it is the refugee who must become criminalized. The refugee must be already outside of society. There is another chapter of Mimi Nguyen's book, The Gift of Freedom, where she talks about, I think that perhaps many of you are familiar with this quite iconic photograph called Napalm Girl. Okay, all right, so many of you do know. I didn't want to, display it. So if you are not familiar with it, if you could take a look at some point to understand the impact that this photograph had. So Mimi Nguyen in The Gift of Freedom, she tracks how the 9-year-old girl in this photograph that was taken in 1972, that 20 years later, she is a political refugee in the United States. And she has this terrific analysis of a 1989 Los Angeles Times Magazine feature story called The Girl in the Photograph. And so now a young woman, Kim Phuc, is basically reintroduced as a newly fashioned beauty, right? So this is a quote from the LA Times Magazine feature, and the writer is talking about Kim Phuc, who is getting photographed for this feature. The young woman poses for the photograph on the low wall of the esplanade above the sea with racing clouds as a backdrop. The young woman loves the camera, and the camera loves her. She is a Vietnamese Marilyn, wrinkling her nose, giggling and tugging at her skirt. She flirts with the photographer, wants to pose, rubbing her cheek against his, giggles and tosses hair caught back by an orange and silver flower. And the writer, Judith Coburn, goes on to say that the photograph, Napalm Girl, had come to symbolize more than any other photograph taken in Vietnam the atrocity of war. But now, as we see through this magazine feature, Kim Phuc has, quote, outlived this ugly, savage image. And the country that brought both the napalm that almost killed her and the doctors who saved her. So I'm bringing this up because the refugee figure actually does a great deal of work also, right, in American popular culture. Again, you can see this, there's a group called Hiroshima Maidens who were brought in via private money by American citizens. So the Hiroshima Maidens were women who had been deeply wounded by the atomic bomb, and Americans had helped pay for their plastic surgery in the US. So what happens in these moments? The unimaginable scale of violence that the United States does overseas, and the attendant horror and implication of all those in the United States in this horror. Suddenly, this unimaginable horror of the atomic bomb, or 388,000 tons of napalm used by the United States in Vietnam, all of this is transformed into a project of rehabilitation and healing. Even with post-war Japan under US military occupation, the story that it was successful and the US had helped Japan rise again from the ashes of war. So again, the grateful or the ungrateful. The language of healing, at least in these terms used by the United States in front of the mass violence it itself enacts, is a language that can easily also help evade the more urgent question of justice. So I think we can also say that the Cold War is not over. You know, it really depends on where you're standing, right? And certainly with everything that is going on the Korean Peninsula, this is quite clear also. And so maybe I will turn to very quickly about the congressional legislation, because this is also something that I had not been, it just doesn't quite make front page news, but it's happening, right? So I'm going to draw upon a scholar, Christine Hong, who is over at UC Santa Cruz. And she does terrific analysis of these two particular bills. So what are these bills? There is something called the North Korean Freedom Act of 2003. And what this act does, well, it's basically a US Congress bill of like literal rescue. Because in this bill, it stipulates that any North Korean child who is found outside of North Korea can then therefore be designated as an orphan and then be adopted by Americans. Okay? So again, statelessness, right? And how this is, as we will see in the following bill, how there is then going to be a way, this logic, right, of thinking about all North Koreans as refugees, as a way, again, to make regime change supposedly inevitable, right? And it's the only option on the table. Okay, so back to the North Korean Freedom Act 2003. Let me read you a little bit of the text of the act. The people of the Korean Peninsula are unjustly divided into two different countries, one of which offers its citizens freedom, prosperity, and hope for the future, and one of which oppresses its peoples and threatens them with imprisonment, starvation, and death. Again, the Cold War rhetoric comes in. Now, in the 2004 Act, it's called the North Korean Human Rights Act. Now, in this act, what they stipulate is the following. So there are a couple different sections. In one of the sections, it's titled Actions to Protect North Korean Refugees. First part of those actions is pursuit of first asylum policy. Number two is adoption of North Korean children by Americans. Then with the following section, and then in that previous section about North Korean refugees, a discussion of how to basically grant refugee status to North Koreans. But immediately after, the next section on this bill is called Actions to Promote North Korean Democracy. So this bill authorizes the president to provide grants to private nonprofit organizations to promote human rights, democracy, rule of law, and the development of a market economy in North Korea, including educational and cultural exchanges, and number 2, increase the availability of information inside North Korea by increasing the availability of information sources not controlled by the government of North Korea, et cetera, et cetera. So again, U.S. militarism, statelessness, these are of one piece. But of course, again, as I didn't have time to go into this, but there is another question I think on the table for us, which is how do those who, from their experience and conditions of either exile or a refugee status, what are they then saying that needs to change in terms of either the refugee regime or, again, as they very, very much intimately know, the relationship between militarism and statelessness. All right, thanks.